Welcome to the Times and the Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival. I'm MG Leonard, and I'm introducing a ramble around the Lake District with incredible author Tom Palmer as he follows in the footsteps of Yossi, Leo and Mordecai, the characters from his new book, After the War, From Auschwitz to Ambleside, and who arrive in Cumbria to rebuild their lives after World War II. Tom Palmer gives us an insight into his research and writing process and braves the wind and rain to introduce his historical novel from the place where it all happened.
Thank you, Mayor, for that introduction, and hello. My name's Tom Palmer, and this is Windermere, which is the largest lake in England. And behind me you can see the beautiful mountains of Cumbria. You can see Lake Windermere stretching up there towards a place called Ambleside, and this is where my book, After the War, is set. But before I speak about the book, I should introduce myself. So I've written quite a few books about football and rugby, but I also write history books. So for instance, this is a book called Over the Line, and that's about real footballers who fought in the First World War. This is a book called Armistice Runner, and that's actually set in the Lake District as well in Cumbria. It's about a girl who's a fell runner, and her great-great-grandfather who was also a fell runner who went to fight in the First World War. And I researched this book round here as well, because just at the top of the lake and along a bit there's a place called Skeleth Bridge, and that was where my main character came from. I've also written a book called D-Day Dog, and this is about a parachuting dog in the Second World War who helped defeat the Nazis. So I'm here today to speak to you about After the War, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you to 3 or 4 of the settings of the book, because when I was writing this, it was really important for me to get my facts right and get the feel of the book right. So what I did was I spent a lot of time here at Windermere finding out about the lake, finding out about the history of the lake, and finding out about an amazing story about a group of children. Now the subtitle of the book, as you can see, is From Auschwitz to Ambleside, and you might have heard of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a concentration camp in the Second World War, where the Nazis sent a lot of people to essentially to murder them, and a lot of those people were Jewish people, and there were other people sent there as well. But this story, After the War, is about a group of 300 Jewish people who survived the Holocaust. If you think about the numbers, they were children, 300 children. During the Second World War, 6 million Jewish people were murdered by the Nazis. 1.6 million of them, 1.6 million, were children. And 300 children and some other children who went to other parts of the country survived the Holocaust and came to live here. So they flew here in August 1945 from a concentration camp to here, and they stayed. If you just look up the lake, just behind the big tree that I'm obscuring, there was a camp there at a place called the Calgarth Estate, and we'll go there later and I'll show you that. But this is their story. So they've survived the Holocaust. They've seen most of their families murdered by the Nazis. They've seen terrible things. They're traumatized. They've had an awful time, but they have each other. And when they arrive here in England, they come to live by this lake. It's summer, it's August, and they come to live by this lake and begin to try to piece together what they can make of their lives, with the support of the Jewish community in Britain and the British people overall. And that's what this story is about. And obviously, like, there was 300 children who came to live by Lake Windermere at the end of the war, and I can't write about 300 children. So what I've done is I've chosen 3. What I've done is I've not actually chosen 3 of the real children. I've based it very much on the real children. In fact, every story in here is based on a memory of the testimony of those children who are now, those who are still alive, who are now old men and women, who've told their story. But I've created 3 composite characters, and a composite character is when you take different people's memories, and which are all valid, true memories, that you put together into 3 characters. So here we have Yossi, Mordecai and Leo, and after the war is their story, and essentially it is a story of refugees. These are children who had nowhere to go and had nothing, and they needed help, they needed support, and they came to this country as refugees. And this country, largely led by the Jewish community in this country, they took these children in as refugees, and many of them stayed in this country as refugees, and many of them went on to have spectacular lives in this country. They had families, and their families are still living and working in this country now. One of them, who was called Ben Helfgott, went on to win gold medals for Great Britain, and they ran businesses and they ran charities, and they do a lot now, even now, to support refugees and people who are suffering in the world, remembering what happened to them. So I'm going to take you to 2 or 3 more places around Lake Windermere, just to tell you a bit about them and to tell you their story. And then it was morning, their first day on the Calgarth estate. Yossi, Leo and Mordecai stood shoulder to shoulder once they'd left the safety of Leo's room and their hostel. For a while they were speechless with wonder. It had been so dark when they had arrived last night. They had no idea really where they were. But now they could see what was to be their home for the next 4 or 5 months. They were surrounded by lush green hills under a bright sky. There were huge clusters of trees, swallows flitting above them. And that is the first morning when the boys, Yossi, Leo and Mordecai, are together, and they wake up the first morning in the Calgarth estate. And here, where we are now, this rugby field, and behind the rugby field over there there's a school called the Lake School. Here is where the buildings were, and I know the buildings were on this rugby field because last year in 2019 I came here and took part in an archaeological dig which uncovered some of the foundations of the buildings where the boys stayed. They came here and they stayed in blocks of buildings, and each of them had their own room with their own bed and their own setup, their own sheets in the bed, and all of these things they'd not had for years and years and years. And coming here is really important for me when I'm writing a book, because although you can't see here the buildings where the children were brought from the concentration camps to live in, I know, I've been here, I've seen the foundations of the buildings underneath this rugby field. I've met some of the boys who were boys then, and 75 years later now are old men. I've met them and taught them here, so I know that this is the place. And for me, when I'm writing about something from history, it's really important for me to get to the place where it happened, even though this is completely different to what it would have looked like then. It's still, I feel something deep down, and I feel the need to come to places like this, but that is supported by other things like research. So I do a lot of research. When I'm writing about something like the Holocaust, you're writing about events that happened 85 to 75 years ago, and you've got to get your facts right, because you're writing about important history. You've got to get your facts right for 2 reasons. One is because you've got to represent the lives of those people who you're talking about, and you've got to say it honestly and truthfully. And 2, there are some people who deny the Holocaust. Some people don't believe, or like to say they don't believe, that the events of the Holocaust took place. And it's really important, so when you're making a book or a film or a television program or anything about the Holocaust, to get your facts absolutely right, which is why I do this sort of research. So when I'm writing a book, of this type, I will read loads. This is my notebook. It was originally, the book was called The Windermere Boys, and in this book, as you can see, there are pages and pages and pages and pages of notes, and that's from reading several books, watching several films, coming here and meeting some of the boys who are the survivors from those events, of the Windermere Boys, but also watching films and visiting places in Poland where some of the other events happen to them in the story. So I've done that research, but that's written research. That's things I write down. And a notebook, if you're a writer, if you want to be a writer as a job, keeping a notebook's a great idea because it can give you loads of facts that you can then use in your story. But I also keep a scrapbook, because the notebook has got words in it, but the scrapbook, for me, the scrapbook's really important because it's visual. It's got visual images in it. So for instance, I will keep pictures of some of the children when they were at Calgarth. I will have pictures of this. Actually, that picture there is what the Calgarth estate looked like 75 years ago when the boys came to live here. I will also keep maps as well. So this is a map of Windermere, which you can see there, and we're roughly there. So maps and things like that help me to get my facts right. And also I've been really lucky because when I was writing this book, I knew there were some local people. So some local people, that was one of the houses that the local people lived in when the children came from the Holocaust, from the concentration camps. And that girl there in the middle with the dog on her knee, the dog's called Spot and the girl is called Joyce. And remember, this was 75 years ago. Now, while I was here doing my research, I met this lady. This is Joyce, and she is the Joyce there with the dog. And she's told me loads of things that I've put in the book because she's given me first-hand testimony of what happened to her. Just like I've had testimony and read and listened to testimony of the people who survived the Holocaust. So two of the boys who came to live right here, they came with nothing and no one, and they came to live right here, was Eric Hirsch and Felix Weinberg. They've written books. Eric's also done a film, and those really helped me because I can read what happened to him, and I can read the events. And what happened to Eric Hirsch and what happened to Felix went straight into the book. So there are stories that they've told that I've put into my story, and that's really important for me to know that, as well as getting the setting right, I'm getting my characters right. So that's how I go about making my characters believable. Also background history. So this is a book by someone called Martin Gilbert called The Boys, and this is a big book about all the things that happened to them. And I know some people don't like this, but I do. Hang on. I underline stuff in books so I can remember it, and that really helps me when I'm doing research. And I'm going to keep this book forever. It's my book, so I think for me it's all right too, because it's my book to write in it. So that's characters, that's setting, that's research, all those things that I put together to try and get the facts right for the story. But another really important thing for me is planning. Like I've got about 300 scenes and things and people that I want to put in the book. I don't know about you, but I can't keep all that in my head. I really struggle to keep stuff like that in my head. So what I do is I make a plan. So this is the plan for after the war. So this book began as this. I'm going to show you it now. I'll show you it at a distance first. So this is the plan, and it's longer. I can't actually do it fully with my arms, my wingspan, and if you look at each one, each blue thing is a different scene, and each different coloured tab underneath is a different character, the three main characters, and what happens to them in the story. And this plan took me 3 or 4 days to get it right, to move things around and put them in the right order. But because I spent 3 or 4 days just with this one piece of paper, that really helps me to get my facts right and to get everything into place for my story. So I do research and then I turn it into planning. And once I've made a really good plan, then I feel like I've done justice to the things like the archaeological dig I did here, meeting the survivors who are still with us, reading their books, and doing all the research that I needed to do. I suppose for me, doing all that allows me to make sure I'm representing those people. So these people suffered terribly in the Second World War, in the Holocaust. They came here to England and they've told their story. They came here, and while they were here in this place, they they began to recover mentally and physically as much as you can from the events that they had seen in the Holocaust, the terrible things that had happened to their families. They began to recover. They started to get physically fit, but they also made friends, and the friendships that these boys made, the boys and girls who were called the Windermere boys, sustained them through life. They still meet every year, and they consider themselves a family, because without a family, because pretty much most of their families who had lived before the war were killed, so they came here as orphans, and they became close with each other and became friends and became each other's families, and that's really important, that those events and those friendships were forged here on this rugby field with these rugby posts, even though there wasn't a rugby field and there weren't rugby posts, because this was a housing estate. And that for me is really important, and that's why I come to places and do my research and try to get my facts right. And there is a charity called the Lake District Holocaust Project, and they know much more than me about the events that happened here and what happened to the people here, and they've helped me as well. So as well as me writing the book, they read through the book, they check it to make sure I haven't made any silly mistakes, and that's how I go about researching a book. Right, I think we need to move on now. I think what we're going to do is, because of the landscape, you can't actually, the lake is just there, but you can't get to the lake because it's private land, and so I need to get to the shore where a lot of the events in this book happen. So a lot of the things that happen in this story happen on the shore of the lake, and I need to get there. So I'm going to have to go and find a way to get myself to the shore of the lake. So I'll see you once I've solved that problem.
And so we came to Carlisle Airport, and from there, either by coach or by army lorries, we were taken to Windermere. I came in an army lorry, I remember. And the first thing, we were taken to our barracks, which were occupied, of course, previously by civilian engineers building the flying boats. And each one of us got a little room, a little cubicle, with a little cabinet to put some belongings into it. Of course, we had nothing to put into the cabinet, because all we had was only what we stood up in. But we felt really great. We had a wonderful clean bed here, white linen, one to each person. We felt we're human beings. We've been treated in the most humane way, with dignity, and we felt great. Each one of us got trifle, I remember. And as it is customary, when you sit down at the table in the dining room and you serve the meal, the first thing that always arrives is buttered bread. Hardly the plate was touching the table, that we grabbed the bread as quick as possible, those who were quick enough, that is, and packed our pockets with it for later. The people in charge of us took us into the kitchen and showed us how many stacks of loaves of bread they've got, and more is arriving tomorrow. There's no need for that. We soon learned. And this is something I look back with great joy, actually. As a result of suffering, but nevertheless great joy.
So we're on Lake Windermere now, and this is the water on which a lot of the story is set. And there's a bit in the book, in After the War, which is very significant towards the end. And one of the things that during the war, before the war ended, this lake, because it's the largest English lake, was used to trial flights of the seaplanes, so the aeroplanes which could land on water, which were helpful in various parts of the world with the war effort. And so the planes used to come along this lake, I'll just show you just a minute, used to come along all the way down the lake, and then they'd take off down there. And I thought at the end, towards the end of the story, that I needed the boys to actually see that. So I'm going to read you sort of that bit now, and we're set on the water where these events happen. When I'm researching a book like this, I canoed up and down this lake just to get a feel for it. And in fact, over there where you can see, hang on, there, that's the shoreline where the boys would have come to play. That's the shoreline nearest to where they were staying, so they would have come here, and the events in the book would have happened like with this backdrop behind them. Anyway, I'm just going to read you the very end and of that section I'm talking about. The three boys sat in silence and shared tight smiles as the background noise became louder. Yossi, his body angled away from the lake, was the last to see it, but he knew what it was from the look of wonder on his friends' faces. He turned to see that he was right. A short Sunderland seaplane began moving slowly up the lake towards the Calgarth estate. At first, it seemed like a large boat with wings, the wake behind it a white line scored up Windermere. But then, Yossi noticed, its nose seemed to push downwards, as if it was going to go under the water, not above it. The wings wobbled from one side, then to the other. Would it get off the water? Could it take off? Really? But then Yossi took a huge breath in as the enormous plane somehow began to lift into the air. For a few seconds there was a tiny gap, maybe a metre, between the flying boat and the surface of the lake, a storm of waves and water filling it. Yossi wondered if it really would take off. It was almost as if the water of the lake wanted to drag it back down. Then he remembered what Jock Lawrence's brother had said. An aeroplane keeps going, building up more and more power before it can lift off. It takes time, but once it has enough power, it leaves the ground. And then the seaplane was airborne, clearly airborne, Yossi and his friends grinning and breaking into spontaneous wild applause as the aeroplane moved upwards, then turned to fly low over the trees and the cluster of houses and hotels on the Calgarth estate. And that is, for me, was a really important part of the story, because this is about these boys who have been through these terrible experiences and they're trying to begin their lives, trying to start their lives again. I sort of did the boat, the flying boat as a metaphor for the boys. Like, even though the forces of gravity and the lake are trying to drag them down, the dark things that have happened to them, they as friends, because they're together, the three of them, they lift off, and that for me was like a really important part of the story. And to read it here for me now with this backdrop behind me, this area where the boys would have been when they were children, is really exciting for me, to be able to come and do that. This is where the story in my book After the War begins. This is Crosby-on-Eden airfield, which is now Carlisle, or the Lake District Airport, right in the northwest corner of England. And I'm just going to speak to you a bit about this airfield and what it means in the context of after the war. I'm actually on a road which occasionally you get cars coming along, so if a car comes along I'll stop and pause, and then we'll carry on. We should be all right. It's not that busy a road. So this is after the war, and this is about 300 children who left the concentration camps of Europe in 1945, August 1945, so just over 75 years ago. They're left in 10 Sterling bomber aeroplanes, which landed here at Crosby-on-Eden airfield. And that is how my book begins. And when I am writing something set like this, what I try to do is to try and immerse myself as much as I can in the story, and and to try and link myself to the story in ways that will be interesting. So what I did was I researched the airfield, and I researched in particular what happened when the children arrived. So they arrived, it was in the afternoon. They arrived, they will have seen the Lake District, which is over there, as they landed on the airfield here, and then they were met by some people, and the pilots were also very important to them. The pilots of the airplanes were very kind to them. They were used to seeing people in uniforms being cruel and murderous. They were used to the Nazis in uniforms. People in uniforms were frightening and brought danger and catastrophe. But the RAF pilots who brought them over from the Czechoslovakia at the time were very kind to them. And I've managed to get hold of a cap that one of the pilots might be wearing, and also a bar of chocolate, a replica of a bar of chocolate. It's not 75 years old, which are part of the story. So these two items in my research were really helpful in that they gave me ideas for what I could put in the story. This, of course, is also added to by information that I've got from the boys themselves. The children who arrived actually have told the story about the chocolate and the hat and such things, and that's allowed me to weave a story from it. Suddenly the road becomes busier, but it's worth it for me. It's worth me doing this event and doing this talk for you in the place and in the places later on in this video that these things actually happen, because coming here to this airfield, which is a story about these children, is really important to me, and is moving for me and makes me have strong emotions in the same way that I've tried to do in the book when telling the story to you. So I'm just going to read you about their first experience. Bear in mind, these are refugees. These are children who have left their home country. They've come here. They've never been to England. Only one of them had any memory of England that I've actually heard, and it was like his dad had a bicycle tire. It said "Made in England" on the tire, and that's all he knew about England. He was from Poland. So they came over here and they landed here, and this is what happened. Once they had disembarked from the aeroplane, Yossi marvelled at the vast expanse of green grass on the airfield. He had lived in so many places over the last few years where there was no grass. Grass like this surprised him. It looked green, so alive. He knelt on the ground and ran his fingers through the thick, lush blades and smiled. Then he heard the sound of an aeroplane. Looking up, Yossi saw another Sterling bomber wobbling from side to side as it descended from the huge blue sky. He knew that there would be 10 of these aeroplanes arriving in total, each with 30 children on board. Yossi stood and gazed around the airfield. A short walk away, there was a small white building with a tower above it, and a group of women standing beside a line of trestle tables. 2 or 3 military trucks were parked behind them. Most of the children had already figured out that there was food and drink on the tables and were moving towards them. Yossi grabbed Mordecai and followed Leo in the direction of the food. Yossi noticed that Leo was holding the spool of wire he'd found on the plane. Some of the women were among the children now, giving out white cups with small handles attached to the side. "Tea?" a smiling woman asked him in English. Yossi took the cup of tea. It looked pale. It had milk in it. "Thank you," he said. The woman was about the same age as Yossi's mother when he had last seen her. His eyes lingered on her face and she smiled back at him. Yossi turned away, not wanting to think about his mother. Not yet. Not now. And there was a pilot jumping down exhausted from the cockpit. He was tall, wearing a peaked cap and walking slowly in heavy boots towards the white building. His uniform troubled Yossi. Men in uniforms were usually cruel and dangerous, but Yossi wanted to speak this man who had given him chocolate. Yossi offered the pilot his cup of tea and repeated the word the woman had used, tea. The pilot stopped. He looked confused, but took the cup. "Thank you," he said, and smiled as Talia joined them. The pilot pointed at the plane. "You like aeroplanes?" he asked Yossi. Talia translated for them. "Yes," Yossi said. "When we saw you coming to bomb the Germans, we cheered. We would run out of our buildings in the concentration camp and watch you and hope that you'd drop bombs nearby where we were." The pilot looked down at the ground and coughed. It was hard for Yossi to work out what he was thinking, but when he looked up, Yossi could tell he was having kind thoughts. It was all in the eyes. Yossi understood that now. A man might have a uniform on, but you could tell if a man wanted to hurt you by looking at his eyes, not his clothes. What happened next astonished Yossi. The pilot took off his cap and after brushing it down, handed it to Yossi. "For you," he said. "Thank you," Yossi stuttered. The pilot smiled and walked off. To the white building. Yossi turned the cap over in his hands. Mordecai and Leo were with him now, Leo eyeing the hat as if it were a loaf of bread. And that day was a very sunny day. Unfortunately today it's raining. That is the story. That is the story of when they landed. And for me, when I was writing that, coming here and seeing what this airfield was like, what this place was like, was really important. But also seeing what the chocolate bars would have looked like, and also what the cap that a pilot would have been wearing and would have given to Yossi as a gift in my story would have looked like too. And for me, those things really helped me put a story together. But I'm going to stop filming now until it stops raining. So I've got a challenge for you, a writing challenge. So we know that here, this is an airfield where 300 Jewish refugees came at the end of the Second World War. They came here, they didn't know they didn't know where their parents were or if they were alive. They didn't know what this country was like. They didn't really know what sort of reception they were going to receive. And I want you, with your writing challenge, to try and imagine what that would be like. What if you arrived at a country you'd never been to, nor even heard of? You had no one from your family with you. You had nothing. You were with some other children, and some of those other children were your friends. But how would you feel? What would it be like? Try and think of it. And one thing I do when I'm writing a story is I try and think of the 6 question words. So what, when, where, how, why, and there's another one, isn't there? Who, that's the one. So those 6 words. And if you think of those 6 words and apply them to the idea that you are going to a country you've never been to before, what has happened? Where have you gone to? Why have you gone there? Who have you gone with, or who have you not gone with? And if you answer those 6 questions, it will help you come up with an idea for a story. That's how I start every book. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your challenge.